I'm Margaret Floyd Barry, Master Restorative Wellness Practitioner, author, speaker, and Executive Director of Restorative Wellness Solutions. Each week, I interview the world's leading experts in functional health and nutrition to uncover the latest research findings, case studies, and evidence-based clinical applications for reversing chronic disease, including actionable insights and strategies you can implement immediately to elevate your practice, increase your impact, and change the way health is delivered. Hello, everyone. I am so excited about today's episode. This was one of those rare occasions where all of my worlds collide, and I got to chat with my running coach, Zach Bitter. Zach is a world record holder, ultra runner extraordinaire, and host of one of my favorite running podcasts, the Human Performance Outlier podcast. I have worked with Zach over the last couple of years, and I was just delighted when we received numerous requests from fellow practitioners who are also runners and or who are working with athletes as their clientele, wanting to understand how better to support runners who want to do things differently. Zach and I get into the weeds on this one. We get into the weeds on low-carb running, the ins and outs of training in ketosis, fasted training, supplementation, recovery. I have to tell you, I loved this conversation so much. And a little behind the scenes, we record these episodes in front of a live audience of restorative wellness practitioners. And sadly, tragically, due to a technical glitch with our recording platform, we had no audience for the whole first half of this episode. It was still an incredible conversation, and we are so excited to share it with all of you now. If you're an athlete from a weekend warrior to a competitive racer, or you support athletes in your practice who are also balancing health considerations, this one's for you. Hello. Welcome everyone to today's episode of the RWS Clinicians Corner. I am super excited for today's guest. This is like scratching a little personal itch of mine. I'm so excited to be chatting with Zach Bitter. He is a professional endurance athlete, coach, and podcast host of Human Performance Outliers podcast. He has broken multiple world and American records and competed for Team USA's 100-kilometer world championship team on 3 occasions. I am also proud to say that Zach has been my personal running coach for the last couple of years, guiding me through my build for the New York City Marathon last fall, and then coaching me through my first ultra, where I ran 50 miles to celebrate my 50th birthday for the 1st of June this year. He is an absolute delight to work with, not just because he is an incredible coach, but also because he explicitly does not follow the old school carb-loading advice and approach to training that's so ubiquitous in endurance sports. And for someone like me, and for many of you listening here today who want to dive into those nitty-gritty details of optimal fueling, tracking biomarkers, and customizing your training to really work with your own unique physiology, and if you have different health constraints like me, he is an absolute wealth of knowledge. So I'm really excited to share him with you all today. So I would love to start right at the beginning. Is it possible to train and perform at high levels on a low carb and or even a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of context probably with that question, but I think there's kind of a couple ways to unpack it. One would be, I think the most common thing you see is you need carbohydrates for endurance training or for athleticism. Well, need's a very powerful word. So usually when I hear that, my brain ultimately goes to, okay, that's like an absolutist type statement. And I tend to shy away from those almost across the board. So need, you definitely don't. Whether it will be beneficial for you or not to have some carbohydrate along for the ride is something that I think is worth considering, and it's likely going to depend on the individual. So there is going to be scenarios where at like the pinnacle of performance, if everything is accounted for and a person is just like generally tolerant of carbohydrate, you're probably looking, at least on the research, the full body of research that we have with endurance, you're probably going to benefit from some carbohydrate. The range of what you would want or need is going to be probably the next question there. the next thing I want to do is kind of unpack like performance, because performance is going to basically stretch the full scale of sports and things like that. Because we do have some sports where the research actually would suggest a strict ketogenic diet would maybe be preferred. I think gymnastics is one of them. Um, if you get long enough into the ultra marathon running world and certain logistical hurdles are present in certain events, then strict ketogenic diets may be preferred just because it's easier logistically and you're not carrying as much essentially. So like these are very obscure races, but they do exist where you're going like from one day to the next and you have to carry all your gear, all your food. You don't provide any of it for you. And these are like multi-day events. So something like that, you can make a strong argument that even a strict ketogenic diet would be preferred in that scenario. Um, Really the way I kind of look at it is if you're going to be looking if you're going to try to maximize performance, when you're doing things that are moderate to high intensity, some carbohydrate will likely aid in that. But if the variables that are unique to you at the individual are such that bringing in carbohydrates create a whole storm of other issues for you, then you're pulling a very small lever at the expense of a large lever in that. So I have coaching clients that I work with where they follow a much more strict ketogenic diet than I do because they have way more stake in removing the carbohydrates for other reasons that, from their standpoint, they just prioritize above and beyond. Um, so it can depend on the person to some degree, but generally speaking, I think carbohydrates are going to be a tool that, if you have available to you, can be useful at the right time.
So, when would you argue it's a good idea to go low carb? Like, is that something that you recommend everyone go lower carb, or is this something that you're really dialing in on an individual basis?
Yeah, it gets pretty individual. I would say I've had some evolution with this as I've seen more research kind of come out over the years. I mean, historically, I would be more like, all right, there are some signs in which I would say, hey, you should check out a low carb ketogenic diet. That would be somebody who is just struggling with fueling during a race, specifically for ultra marathons, especially if they're having a hard time hitting the recommended amount of carbohydrates per hour in their event. We can kind of pull the largest lever in fat oxidation, which is just a reduction of carbohydrate. So that one was a little more clear to me. There's a recent study actually that came out in the last year that actually just looked at it was 10 runners. This wasn't ultra marathon. This was actually more like shorter endurance based. And they were looking at like a strict ketogenic diet versus a higher carbohydrate diet, calorie controlled, so like the group wasn't gaining weight or losing weight to any appreciable degree that would skew the results. And the findings were actually interesting. I hope they continue to look at this because I think it was 3 out of 10 of those individuals actually had pre-diabetic fasting blood sugar levels on a calorie-controlled high carbohydrate diet that totally reversed when they went on the. I mean, I think their carbohydrate input was like 50 grams, and they were training somewhere in the neighborhood around 40 miles per week. So they're gonna be in like ketosis with those ranges. Um, and I mean, it totally resolved. So it's let's just imagine like let's grant that study is like representative of the populace then, and 3 out of 10 endurance athletes, there's something unique about that activity and a carb input at moderate to high levels that could still put them in a position where they're sitting at pre-diabetic fasting blood sugar levels, which, if I were one of those 3 out of 10, I wouldn't want that necessarily to be a compromise I'd be looking for. And this is maybe where like Tim Noakes will talk about. I think maybe sometimes he projects it on on everybody to some degree, but there are probably people who, if they follow a high carbohydrate diet and practice an endurance lifestyle, could drive themselves into issues down the road, even if it's not something that's problematic for them in the early signs. So my hope is like that study will get more attention, get more reproducibility with it in larger populations, and actually just a wider range of people, because I mean it was a very specific training protocol they were following too, so that we can get a little more idea of like what we're looking at with that at a population level, and then have like more clear kind of objective ways for someone to say, hey, maybe I'm better off reducing my carbohydrate, whether that's just into the low carbohydrate category or a strict ketogenic category, because this lifestyle I'm trying to do is not very receptive of a moderate to high carbohydrate approach. So, I'll get people, and I probably select for more people than the average endurance coach just because I've been open about my approach with low carbohydrate and things like that.
Yeah.
So, if someone is already in a position where they're like, hey, going moderate high carbohydrate, I've tried that, didn't work. I'm looking for a coach who understands that. My name is probably going to come up at some point. So I probably see a higher percentage of people coming in right out the gate saying, "Hey, I'd like to do this," or "I'm already doing this." Um, or are just people who are looking to troubleshoot because they found that they're struggling with the kind of the current recommendations on endurance training and stuff like that. So then they start looking around for information and resources. And I've been doing it now for I think it'll be 13 years come this fall. So I've had a lot of experience with myself and other runners kind of partaking on it or taking on it. So I would say like generally like I tend to follow the principle if it's not broke, don't try to fix it with people and their dietary habits. Uh, and then it's kind of a more come to me approach, I guess, where like if a person is not satisfied with the way things are going with their nutrition and their performance, they're usually pretty receptive to make a change. And I find when they're in that situation, it's just a little easier to educate versus trying to project it onto them right out the gate, more or less. That's kind of the strategy I've used in the past and today.
Have you found that there are different, stages in the training cycle? For example, I mean, we're talking a lot about ultra here, but in other distances, I'm thinking specifically. I mean, I'm marathon and half marathon distance are my normal distances, and so in those, we're definitely thinking about fueling during the race. We're not facing the same kind of logistical challenges as you would with some of these ultra races. And you're also really, pacing is going to be different and that kind of thing. Do you find that there are different times during the training cycle where it can be more beneficial to go into full ketosis and then sort of introduce strategically some carbohydrates at different points in that training cycle?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the way I like to look at it is when we're talking endurance training, we're looking at like 80+% of the training volume being at a low intensity or in the easy category. And for those type of workouts, minus like very long duration scenarios, you don't really need a carbohydrate input. Certainly, someone on a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet wouldn't need a carbohydrate input for that. So the majority of the time, you can kind of carry on with your preferred way of eating within that kind of framework. And it's not until you get to like workouts where we're looking to get into like the moderate intensity, so like kind of your classic like lactate threshold, tempo run type stuff, long interval stuff, or like VO2 max, short interval type training sessions where I think introducing some carbohydrate could be useful. Uh, I think there's probably some nuance there. So if someone was to decide, say like, okay, I'm on a strict ketogenic diet, I want to go and I want to do this short interval session. Do I need carbohydrates for it? They probably don't. They could probably get through that single session without bringing back any carbohydrates. But if they're in a like speed work development phase where we're doing two, maybe three quality sessions in a week's time frame, I think that eventually catches up with them to the degree where after like week after week going through
Yeah.
that cycle, they find a spot where just the normal processes of like converting proteins and fats into carbohydrates isn't going to be at a rate at which their lifestyle is likely asking for it, especially if they also are like relatively high volume in their training as well. Uh, so that's the point when I'm usually getting a little more creative with carbohydrate in my training and in my coaching clients that are following a lower carbohydrate is that's where I'll usually say like this is where I'll typically see people benefit from bringing back some carbohydrate around those higher intensity workouts, those moderate intensity like longer interval type sessions and we play around with it from there. So like sometimes like someone will maybe be resistant to it. They'll like, okay, I really like the way I'm eating. I don't really want to change it. Great. Let's just go through the training cycle and kind of see what happens. And then we just see how the performance goes with those workouts. And if they find like, hey, I feel like I am kind of struggling to get into that last gear. Um, maybe I should try a little bit of carbohydrate. Then we start playing around with that. And then we start introducing some around that workout and just see if we can kind of increase the performance on that a little bit through that. I would say most of my coaching clients are probably more low carb than strict ketogenic diet. So we're often already at a place where they're more interested in just like, hey, tell me what's worked best for the majority of people you've worked with that are following this approach, and I'll try that first, and then if it doesn't work, we can always pivot back down to lower amounts or none, or increase beyond what we were typically doing. So I have like some evidence that would suggest that like if you're in a race type setting and carbohydrate replacement is going to be something you want to try to leverage from just a reduction in perceived effort or even just to defend blood sugar levels, liver and muscle glycogen, stuff like that. Most of my ultramarathon runners are usually going to be targeting somewhere around 30 grams per hour, which is about half to, depending on which recommendations you look at, a third of what you would normally see recommended for a moderate to high carbohydrate athlete. Um, I actually had an interview with a guy named Matt Carpenter who he does a lot of research on low carbohydrate ketogenic endurance because he's just seeing more people do it. And for him, he's just like, you know what, whether this is the best way, the worst way, or somewhere in between, neutral way of going about
Mhm.
things with endurance is sort of besides the point because if people are going to do it, we want to find the protocols that are going to work for them that deviate from what we would normally recommend. And he said that a lot of his runners that are coming through that are kind of practicing that way would be kind of in a similar amount of gram per hour target for race day.
Good to know. Good to know. So if someone comes to you and they're already a fat burner, are there any special considerations they need to be taking into consideration when they're in their training? Is there anything different that they need to be doing aside? They come to you, they're already eating a low carb and or a ketogenic diet, somewhere in that range. Is there anything like, do they need to be supplementing differently? Do they need to be just mindful of certain either symptoms or inputs? Anything they need to be thinking of specifically?
Yeah, I find that a lot of times, like someone who's in that spot, especially if they're new to running or they're starting to ramp up training and they haven't kind of played around with it within the context of low carb ketogenic before, we're probably going to need a little more electrolytes or at least a little more like salt in their diet, assuming they can tolerate that. Just because when you think of it, just like the way your body sort of behaves with carbohydrates at a moderate high intensity, you are having some support from them in terms of staying hydrated as well as some additional fluid retention. So we don't necessarily want their blood volume to drop to the degree where we see a performance dip there, and then make it feel like, okay, this trade-off isn't worth it when we wouldn't really need to be bringing back carbohydrates at that point. We would just need to be more mindful of hydration and stuff like that. So that's usually one of the topics we'll go over is we'll try to see if there's any reason to think like that they would need more of that. And that's a pretty easy kind of like N of one practice where it's like if they're feeling a certain way during training workouts and things like that, and we send them out with more fluids, more electrolytes or something like that, and then they notice like a reduction in perceived effort or an improvement in their in the quality of their workouts, then we've likely are trending in the right direction, and then it can just be about kind of figuring out what the amount and frequency would be for them at the individual level versus anybody else. But that's a decent one. Then it's just kind of just like usually with most of the people that are coming to me on a low carbohydrate, they're curious about just kind of the stages of training. So like base work development, what do I need to do differently, if anything, with my diet during this? Speed work development, what should I do for like the for this phase of training that's maybe different from what I'm normally doing, or if we want to go into the more micro sense, like what do I do on a long run versus a rest day, where
Yeah.
the lifestyle of an endurance athlete from an energetic standpoint is quite polarizing. You have parts of the year where you're maybe in an off season and doing a lot less work, versus like you're peaking for a marathon, in which case you might be doing a couple quality sessions, a long run with some goal marathon pace in it, some rest days. So there's like a lot of variance in there versus the average person who can more or less within probably a few hundred calories predict what they're going to be going through on a daily basis. So sometimes it's just kind of like figuring out, making sure that they're staying on top of their intake within the parameters of those different types of workouts or rest days, and then when is the more preferred time to have carbohydrates if they're going to pull that lever at all within the context of those type of training sessions. So some that stand out would be like long run stuff. I find it's like a good opportunity for most longer races to practice what you're going to be doing on race day for at least some of them, because that's your way to kind of stress test that protocol. So I would say, like with my athletes that are going to be doing any sort of carbohydrate fueling during race day, we will use their long runs with a little more carbohydrate support just to get them kind of used to and accustomed to that and recognize what the difference they're going to get from that. And sometimes that also answers some questions for us too. If it's just like, if, say I've had someone who's been just kind of going about all their runs fasted, and then we do one where we bring back a little bit of carbohydrate, and they notice that they have an improvement in kind of the quality of that session. Well, we might want to kind of like keep note of that, especially on workouts where high quality is a little harder to get to due to the intensity of it or the duration of it. Um, Versus like someone who kind of does the same thing and notices no difference. That might just be an individual trend that's interesting to note for them versus somebody else, in terms of what we would maybe want to leverage on a carbohydrate side of things on race day or during key workouts. Um, the other one is just like kind of the speed work development phase is a little kind of it's probably the most polarizing, because now not only do we have like bigger training days and lighter training days, but we also have like greater variance in the intensity that people are going to be doing. So it could be something where like on Tuesdays and Thursdays, let's say on Tuesdays you're doing like a higher intensity short interval session. Thursdays you're doing a moderate to moderately high long interval session. And then Sundays you're doing a long run. And we have 3 days there that are going to stand out quite a bit. So maybe we look at it through a multi-day lens versus a single day when it comes to carbohydrate consumption. So if I had someone who is targeting, let's say, on average 100 grams of carbohydrate per day, they may actually benefit from looking at like that speed work day and a rest day after that as like the same, or looking at those two as like, well, how do I distribute the carbohydrates I would normally have on average over those 2 days to better support the higher intensity session, and then
Right.
have less of them on the rest day when I likely don't need that carbohydrate support. So if we look at it through that, sometimes I will have a scenario where we'll just consolidate like more of the carbohydrate from a 2 or 3 day moving number around those sessions that are more higher intensity. And then on days where they're recovering from that, we leverage like their lack of need of a higher energy or a higher or faster acting fuel source. And we just go a little lower than they would normally average. So then over the course of those 2 to 3 days, they're probably not deviating too far from their normal averages. They're just positioning them a little differently.
That's so helpful. And in those days when they're doing a more intense quality workout, are you and they're then thus consuming more carbohydrates? Are you bringing that in before, during, and after, or mostly before and during the workout? Like, what's the timing of that structured around the workout specifically?
Yeah, I'm usually more inclined to kind of, if they don't have a preference or any background data as to how they've responded to the different input times, then I'll usually just skew it more towards the end, like the end or after, because I'm
Okay.
really more concerned about them getting back ready for their next interval session than I am them needing that during that particular one. So like if you even if we took like a moderate to high carbohydrate athlete and we had them do a single speed workout session, if it's like 60, maybe upwards to 90 minutes, other than like just potentially like almost like a placebo perceived effort reduction through the presence of carbohydrate being, they actually have some studies on this where they had people do some moderately high to higher intensity endurance work, and they had them take in a carbohydrate solution, and they also had them just take it, swish it around their mouth, and spit it out. So it's basically like Gatorade or something like that. And they noticed they both got the reduction in perceived effort. So it wasn't the actual carbohydrate creating that reduction, it was the anticipation of it. So what that tells us is in a single session, the actual introduction of carbohydrate is likely not necessary to maintain quality, but it may eventually catch up to them if they're, say, on that Tuesday, Thursday speed work cycle, long run Sunday, where if they're just like not replacing any carbohydrate after those high quality sessions, they may find that over the course of days or weeks that they find that they're starting to kind of get a little flatter on those, in which case then I would just say, hey, whatever meal you have post training session when we're doing intervals or speed work, let's make that a focal point for, some of the carbohydrate that you would normally eat, because I think that's going to probably get you back to where we want you to be for the next training session that's got a high quality demand to it.
Love it. This is so great. So let's talk about the fueling specifically. And I'm thinking here primarily for longer efforts when you're actually fueling during the workout and or race. Um, Glucose gels, of course, are the thing that, most people turn to. Are there options to that, alternatives to that, that are either more real food based, but then are we compromising on performance? And or are there options that are not carbohydrate at all? And the option I'm thinking of here is exogenous ketones, but I'm sure there's others that I'm not even aware of. So how do you strategize the during the workout or race fueling if we're really thinking that lower carb or even keto approach?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's definitely opportunity to go about a lot of these races without any fuel. I'm working with a client right now who prefers to stay strict ketogenic, and she's doing like 50Ks and 80K races, and she's just not that interested in bringing back carbohydrates for that. So she is interested in maintaining some semblance of like energy intake during some of those longer sessions though. So, a lot of people will turn to like more like solid food options for those longer races, which is actually the recommendation to some degree. If you look at single day ultra recommendations, they're going to recommend you have like around a 50-50 split between sports products and solid foods anyway. So that's a little bit easier for them because they can just like, snack on things that are a little more protein, fat based, that they've normally eaten that aren't too difficult to digest. So, I mean, some common ones are just like people will actually like bring like a baggie with salty bacon in it or like, sausage and cheese and that sort of thing. Um, Nut butters can be a useful tool in these, and you're going to get a little bit of carbohydrate with those, but generally speaking, compared to the alternatives, it's going to be a lot higher in um, fats and a little bit of protein. They do have some products out there. The nutrition product I use is a company called S Fuels, and they make a product that's called. It was originally called Train. They just kind of rebranded it. It's going to be called Zone 2 now. So it is basically a powder that you would mix in with your drink, similar to like any other sports product that would be carbohydrate based, but it's built with fat metabolism in mind. So not only will it produce or provide fats and a little bit of protein as opposed to carbohydrates to your drink, but it's also designed to help with like digestion and help with increased fat oxidation rates and things like that. So, um, if someone's looking for kind of like what is the cleanest like trade out where I was using a sports drink or a gel, what can I use that's got no to little to no carbohydrate in it? That's going to replicate that for the most part. They can kind of mix it and go about it the same way as they would, and then blend in some solid food fat sources as well if they want to do it that way. That's usually a good way to go about it.
Exogenous ketones?
Oh yeah, sorry about
Do you
that.
use them at all?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been going pretty deep into the exogenous ketone research, at least what we have. I would say what we know right now is it's still kind of in its infancy in terms of what we know. We've got a lot more questions than answers, but there is some promising stuff. I think the biggest promise would be probably actually in the recovery side of things, and then lower intensity races. So if we're looking at races that are like probably like zone two, maybe zone three and below, some exogenous ketones would potentially be helpful in from like a mental focus standpoint. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of research on ketogenic athletes using exogenous ketones because I mean that's would make sense that they would be able to use. It's a calorie source essentially too. It's like if I take
Yeah.
I'll take like delta G ketones and it's like 180 calories in one of those jars. So it's like it's not a trivial amount. It's
Yeah.
going to give you some energy from that actual substance. Um, the research is a little more mixed with when we get into like higher intensity stuff where and this sort of makes sense to me. It's like if we're looking to go glycolytic, like even if you're ketogenic, you still want your body to tap into liver and muscle glycogen when you really pull that lever to go faster. The hope there is that you're maintaining high enough fat oxidation rates in those settings that you're not depleting to the degree where your performance suffers if you're not bringing back any carbohydrate. But if you're asking your body to make that metabolic shift to produce the fuel for that type of an intensity, an exogenous ketone could potentially kind of interfere with that, I suppose. So that would maybe be like the argument against using them for something a little higher intensity. Um, well, yeah, I mean the most promising research right now is probably in recovery and then some like mental focus and things like that. So like longer, lower intensity races or training sessions. So I'll use them in like long run settings, race settings when I'm doing ultra marathon stuff. And then sometimes when my peak training, if I'm doing like a big quality workout, I'll have some like post workout or something like that when it's leveraging kind of like, okay, now I need to recover, get the adaptations, and get ready for the next session.
Have you seen any research, or is there research that exists on kind of a double dipping strategy where athletes are fueling both with carbohydrate and exogenous ketones? I've heard of that. I don't know if of any of the research, if there has been formal research on it.
Yeah, and that's most of the research that are done on like inter-competition or intra-workout is going to be like an exogenous ketone in the presence of a carbohydrate. And that makes more sense to me in the sense of like if you're someone who, let's say you're somebody who is likes the low carbohydrate ketogenic way of stuff, but they're also like I would like to bring in some carbohydrate during race and see if I can kind of get a bit of a performance boost from that. But they want to maintain like they want to preserve their blood ketone levels. I mean, that's what an exogenous ketone will
Right.
essentially do. Like if I went and just ate some carbohydrate and saw my ketones drop down to next to nothing, if I took a serving of, say, 25 to 30 grams of exogenous ketones, I would easily be up into the 2+ millimole range after that. So, yeah, it can definitely be something that would be I think that would probably be the preferred approach to do it versus just using it in isolation without any carbohydrate inputs.
Okay. Last question, and then I want to move into fasted training. So, we often are supporting clients to make the transition from eating moderate or high carbohydrate to low carbohydrate or keto and or ketogenic diets outside of the context of training, right? And people can go through like the keto flu and those withdrawal symptoms and whatnot. When you add in that layer of endurance training, are there factors, how long does it take the body to adapt to being a fat burner from being, using primarily glucose and carbohydrates as fuel? Is that different from somebody making that shift just normally minus the endurance training? Like add in the endurance training. What are you seeing in terms of sort of managing that transition and supporting that transition? And along with that question, do you see a dip in performance that then kind of comes back out the other side? And how do we support them through that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, like endurance training on average would support kind of a transition in the sense that there's kind of two things to consider with this. One is you're just putting fast forward on your metabolism for like periods of time during the day, which just means like if you were to like, let's say for example, you were to do a 24-hour fast, um, you would burn whatever your resting metabolic rate plus whatever kind of light activity you were likely doing during that. Now, if you do that same thing, plus you add in like a 60-minute run or a 90-minute run, it's the same 24 hours, but your energy expenditure is going to be, maybe four or five, depending on how fast you're running, 600 plus calories on top of that. So you're sort of like pushing your body into that state of, I need more energy in a shorter period of time. And if there's no exogenous carbohydrate available, it's going to start leveraging fat as a fuel source, especially if that running's done at a lower intensity. So the way I like to look at this is like there are multiple levers that can be pulled to improve fat oxidation rates or to encourage your body to leverage ketosis. And the big one is going to be just dietary carbohydrate reduction. But the next biggest one is actually just endurance training to the degree where if we look at the fat oxidation rates of somebody on a high carbohydrate diet and then put them on an endurance training program, their fat oxidation rates will improve even without reducing that carbohydrate. Now they can further improve them by reducing carbohydrate on top of that. So it's usually if someone's really interested in getting like really high fat oxidation rates or levels of ketosis on a consistent basis, then they're going to want to pull more than one of those levers versus, I mean, I guess they could just pull the ketogenic lever, but they're going to want to pull that one on top of the training stimulus side of things if they want to get there in most cases. So what I usually see is somebody who's including endurance training, low intensity into the early phases of their training. It actually gets them there a little bit quicker. And it's also kind of like an accelerant if you do have a scenario where you go and have carbohydrate when you maybe didn't intend to. So like a good example, this would be like, okay, I've been like on a ketogenic diet for 4 weeks, went out with some friends, we went out to eat, and I just ended up eating a ton of carbohydrates. Now I'm out of ketosis. Someone who's just kind of a little more sedentary, they may see that kind of be the case for the next day, two, three, before they kind of get back to those levels of ketones that they had before. Whereas you have the endurance athlete, they do that. Maybe the next day they go out for a longer run. They might be right back in ketosis within 12 hours after that. So it tends to be kind of an aid in the sense that it encourages fat oxidation, especially at lower intensities, and trains the body essentially to be able to use that fat as a fuel at a higher degree and more efficiently along the intensity spectrum too. So um,
Right.
in terms of timelines, though, I mean, it's usually like I still usually like to see like at least 4 weeks before someone starts kind of like losing faith in the approach if they're looking to kind of like mix both of these things with performance and endurance and also a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. Um, because they may accelerate their rate of getting into ketosis with the endurance training, but that doesn't mean they're going to be out there performing as well as they would otherwise. They
Right.
so usually during that phase, it's kind of like I usually say, just don't pay attention to your pace, pay attention to the effort, and let's do a lot of low intensity training during this phase, and just wait for your body to kind of get a little more efficient with this. And then once we kind of get there, we should see a normalization of their pace at lower intensities. That's a pretty good sign that their body's now in a good state of fat oxidation. And then that's kind of the point where we can start building volume. We can start considering a speed work development phase, and we probably won't pivot off of their dietary inputs at that point until we get to a phase where we're going to maybe change the training to the degree where we do like a speed work development phase, and then we're kind of back to where we were before when we were talking about whether they should or shouldn't bring back carbohydrates for that. So again, I usually like to kind of let them make that decision if they want. After I kind of give them kind of examples of what normally happens with my low carbohydrate clients, and if they decide, hey, I'd like to just see what this is like on a strict ketogenic diet, cool, let's start rolling out the speed workouts and see how it works. We can always adjust if we need to.
Let's switch gears, and I want to talk now about training fasted. So first off, let's define what that even means by training fasted. I think there's a difference between, running first thing in the morning on an empty stomach versus, you talked about a 24-hour fast or, deeper fast. So when we say training fasted, what is the definition of that, or are there different definitions?
Yeah, I think it probably just depends on what the person is trying to leverage with that. So if someone wants to do a fasted run, if their goal is to improve their fat oxidation rates, meaning like they want to encourage their body to be better at burning fat across the intensity spectrum, and one of the levers they're going to try to do that for is by taking advantage of the fact that they haven't eaten anything since dinner the night before, get up in the morning, going out for a run. They can do that just as well without going without any calories. They just want to abstain from carbohydrates at that point. So let's say that person wakes up and they have like some scrambled eggs or something like that for breakfast, and they go for their run. They're still going to improve their fat oxidation rates to the same degree, if not more, than they would if they just woke up that morning, just had like a cup of water or black coffee or something like that, and then went out for that run. If their goal is to just see like, all right, I want to leverage fat metabolism endogenously, so like literally the pulling the fat off of your body and metabolizing that as an energy source, a fasted run in that scenario would be abstaining from all calories altogether, carbohydrates, protein, fats, everything. So you'd want to stick to just like plain water, maybe electrolytes, and then or coffee. I guess you could have black coffee or tea or something like that as well.
Okay. So fasted training. So let's assume not anything. So empty stomach or just the black coffee, but of
Sure.
electrolytes. Good idea. Yes or no? And caveat, are there times when that is appropriate not appropriate. I'm thinking here, there's a lot of talk in the space right now. Is it for like female athletes? Is it, certain times of stages of life? Is
Mhm.
there a difference? So is there a difference between sexes in terms of how beneficial this is? Are there differences in terms of stage of life in terms of how beneficial this is?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, if the person is, let's say here's where it could be problematic. If the person was at their goal weight, and they were doing fasted long runs, trying to leverage like the increased fat oxidation rate side of things, or just trying to improve their ability to tolerate, going longer periods of time. For whatever reason they're doing it, if they're unable to achieve their energy output by consuming enough food in the window of time they're giving themselves with the rest of the day, then that's probably going to be a problem because they're going to end up losing weight and they're going to end up suffering in performance. And that's usually most of these issues that we see with fasted long runs and things like that, or fasted training or fasting in general, is if the person's losing too much weight. So it's not as much,
Right.
it's kind of one of those things where did the fast cause it? It's like it's kind of indirectly associated with it because it's creating an environment in which they're not bringing in enough food. But if they were able to fill the rest of that day with enough food to maintain weight, then they're likely not looking at any really consequential things from that. There are some caveats, though. I mean, we do have things like, if you go long enough without food, that you're by doing that, you're not taking in protein. So if it's causing a person to hit their energy totals for the day but be lower in protein than they would benefit from, or optimize from, then that could be a problem, and that could be remedied by like abstaining from the fast and having a protein source before that training session, or breaking that fast early with a protein source. So the way I usually look at it is like, um, if someone's getting the right amount of protein and they're getting the right amount of calories, it's not nearly as important how they distribute that as it is getting that. There
Right.
may be some benefit from, say, having a more spread out protein dosage over the course. This isn't necessarily like concrete in the research, but you can get a little bit better protein muscle synthesis as far as we know by having like a bolus of protein, say, every 3 or 4 hours versus all of it once during the day.
Right.
Um, that's probably going to be more for some, like the degree to which that's important compared to getting enough is so small that it's likely going to be of consequence to someone who's actively trying to add muscle mass to them versus trying to
Mhm.
maintain. So maybe not as big of an issue for endurance athletes as it would be for someone who's like a bodybuilder or like trying to actively gain weight or something like that, in which case would maybe work against their lean tissue side of things. But um, yeah, I think like performance would be the next thing to consider. So generally speaking, like it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. If the training session isn't that long, if it's like 60 to 90 minutes, there's not great evidence to suggest that adding food before that is going to necessarily improve that. If they're getting out longer than that, if they're doing like their long run and they're fasting going into it, there's a chance that that could maybe become problematic to some degree. But it's probably going to be a case by case scenario versus something where it would be like, oh, just don't even bother trying it. I tend to look at my long runs in two different categories. One is like race day practice, in which case I'm not going to do those fasted because I'm going to be practicing what I'm doing on race day. But I also like to do some of them where it's like, okay, I'm going to go out for a little bit of a longer running session and I'm not going to fuel before and during it because that's kind of like my field data for like, am
Right.
I able to tolerate this long, low intensity training session without an input, a carbohydrate input or a calorie input? And if I can get through that long run and it's not really that much more taxing or more difficult than when I'm fueling, um, that's a good sign that I don't probably have an issue with fat oxidation rates. I'm actually probably like leveraged at the maximum for that, for what I would need. And then it's more about kind of like preparing for those hours beyond that in a longer duration race that I might be doing, where now all of a sudden I could find myself in some trouble if I'm doing no fueling at all for, something that's a full day in length or something like that.
Right. For somebody who wants to build full day fasting into their schedule and they're actively training at the same time, when is the best time for them to do that? On a recovery day, on an easy workout day? Like when would you strategically fit that into the overall plan and schedule?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say like if I were going to do something like that, I would probably favor the lower output days, so like a rest day or an easier day.
Yeah.
The argument against that would be like, hey, that's your recovery day, and part of recovery is trying to make sure that you're like making sure you're giving your body what it needs to do that. So if I were to do that, I would probably just be a little more conscious about like, let's say they're going to do a 24-hour fast, they do a harder training session that day, and then the next day they're going to do the fast. I would just make sure you get a really good dinner in before you start that
Right.
fast, so that you have some resources on board to, kind of aid in the recovery process, and you're not getting yourself into trouble with that.
Okay. I want to just ask one question now about pre-workout fueling, sort of alternative sources, and then I want to switch into sort of managing some more complex health issues alongside this training. So we've talked about fasted workouts, and we've talked about, if you're going to do maybe some caffeine, some electrolytes. Are there places to do kind of a hybrid, so you're not eating a full meal, like you're not having the eggs or the smoothie or whatever it is that people are doing before their workout, but using something like maybe essential aminos, or again, well, we talked about exogenous ketones, and it sounds like you're using that more as a post workout strategy as opposed to a pre-workout strategy. Are there any other things that you do, any kind of tricks that you do that is not a full meal, but are either supplements or maybe pre-workout drinks, anything like this that you will do to before a workout to enhance performance of it that's not a full meal?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on a couple of them. I would say like I like caffeine, and if I can get caffeine with like an L-theanine with it too, that's kind of preferred, because I find that kind of like helps with like the caffeine being kind of a more of a like kind of a calm focused additive versus like, okay, now I'm all jittery and I feel like I'm shot out of a cannon, which, if you're doing a really short interval session, maybe you do want to be shot out of a cannon, but usually that kind of has a drop off at some point. So you want to time it right if you're going to do that. I prefer like the caffeine L-theanine combination before workouts, um, for that kind of controlled sense of energy. Electrolytes, if it's going to be something where, especially this time of year when it's a little hotter out, just to make sure I'm keeping blood volume up and I'm in a position where I'm not going to hit a level of dehydration where one, my performance dips during that workout, or gets to the point where now all of a sudden I'm looking at 24, maybe 48 hours before I feel back to normal with that. Because if you get severely dehydrated, you might be looking at a 48-hour period of time before your body kind of gets back to that. Um, yeah, those are the big ones. Like anything else is usually situational. So like if I were going to do like an amino acid or something like that, that would maybe be a scenario where I don't want food for one reason or another. Because I mean, I typically like to train on an empty stomach if I can. So, or relatively empty anyway. Liquid stuff is usually more tolerable, but that would maybe be helpful if you're trying to kind of like counteract any sort of like scenario where you're gonna get some muscle catabolism from the training session. That could maybe be helpful in that scenario. But generally speaking, if someone's getting enough protein in their diet, amino acid supplementation is maybe going to be just on top of something they're already adequate in. But if you're not, then it probably does have a value add there. So that maybe has a I don't know what the jury's is on amino acids and fasting, if that's something you can do and still be compliant or not. But if it is, then I would say that maybe would be something worth considering when you're doing some of these training sessions fasted.
Excellent. Okay, let's switch gears again. And I'm just going to take a moment. Ben can edit this out. For those of you who are here live, I just want to apologize so much. There was a big glitch with Riverside earlier, and we didn't we couldn't tell. Well, I couldn't tell. It looked like there was nobody here, but I couldn't tell. Anyways, I only learned halfway through this interview that you all weren't here live. So I'm super sorry. If you have questions for Zach, if I have not already asked them, we had a really good complex conversation about low carb and ketogenic diets with training. So I think we covered a lot with that. But if you have questions, pop them in the chat. And I know what I've already asked him. So if I haven't already asked him those questions, I will make sure to ask them, and then you guys will get the recording. So thank you for your patience with us, and I'm super sorry about that glitch. So let's switch now to recovery and some of your favorite tools about this. So specifically, as I shared at the outset, a lot of us are working with individuals, or we ourselves are individuals who are managing complex health issues alongside wanting to train, whether that's autoimmune or, biotoxin illness, mold illness, MCAS, like a whole bunch of different things. So we're juggling these different things, but still have ambitious training goals. So recovery, of course, is going to be an absolutely essential piece of this puzzle. I think it's essential for everyone, but it's an absolute non-negotiable if you have somebody who has another health issue. So let's talk about this piece. How do you calculate how much recovery is needed and kind of guide that process?
Yeah, this is a good question. I would say, like, generally speaking, when you're thinking of just what the goal is with training, is we want to create an environment where your body is encouraged to make an adaptation that's going to make you better down the road, and we're sort of like tapping into that consistently to the degree where, from a physiological standpoint, you're probably looking at 4 to 6 weeks or so before you start seeing some, like, decent adaptations for things like speed work and stuff like that. But when you think of just adaptations, there's the training stimulus, and then there's the question you basically asked, which is recovery. That's the second piece to that puzzle. A lot of times, I think when we're training, we think like, okay, I did the workout, great. I got what I needed out of that. You're halfway there. You're halfway there. You have to recover through, like, nutrition and just rest. So in terms of like when we repeat the process, there are some things that I'm usually looking for. Like I'm usually tracking a lot of metrics, like what is the person's heart rate doing, both during the training sessions, after the training sessions, when they wake up in the morning. What is the quality of the training session that they just did relative to what we've seen in the past? What is the current, what are their, if we're just starting, we don't have all that data. Like, where are they currently at? What have they been doing for the last couple of months? Because if someone's like just starting, minimal inputs is going to be all that's needed to get that adaptation started. So we don't want to necessarily get out ahead of ourselves and create a scenario where we're kind of, I call it stealing from tomorrow, where we do too much work on any one given day, and then all of a sudden our aggregate amount of work over weeks is lower because we need additional recovery because the stimulus was too large, and now we're doing less training in total because of the extra recovery requirement. So some of it is just kind of like learning where they're at and then adding just like a little bit beyond what they were in the past, and then watching to see. I don't think, like, people get a little bit maybe hung up on like a bad workout from time to time. I think it's kind of part of the process to a large degree. You get better at predicting and avoiding them. But, if you have a scenario where, let's say we did like a few days of training and now all of a sudden you go out for your next session and you just feel a little flat, the pace is slower at the heart rate target. Maybe the pace is slowing down over the course run. That's just like a sign that, okay, we've probably hit the point where the stimulus is high enough. We overshot by a little bit. That's not a problem in the micro sense. It's a problem when you kind of continue to do that over and over again. So when we kind of start seeing that sort of thing, we're like a new runner, I might just see, okay, that workout was a little bit suboptimal compared to what we normally see. All right, let's back off a little bit. Let's do a little more rest before we add another training stimulus in, and then let them kind of get back to feeling normal, and then we start that process again. And then it's just kind of like sort of rinsing, repeating that within the context of what they're training for. So I like to call it like kind of their global fitness, where what is your relative, how does like your easy category, your moderate category, and your higher intensity category compare with one another? So if we start doing workouts where we have data on all three of those intensities, then I can start looking at things like, is this person's strength in the easy category? do they have a strength or a weakness in the moderate or high category? And that can kind of tell us like where maybe the bigger margins for improvement are and where we're going to maybe get very little improvement even with an increase in training stimulus. So that can kind of guide us as to what to do next. Um, and that can also kind of help us with like what kind of recovery they may need to. So like if someone is going to be going into a training cycle where we identify speed work is going to be something that's going to move the needle for them the most, we just probably have to be more mindful about what we're doing between those. So like if they're new to it or it's the first time they're doing well, I may give them a couple easy days, if not more. We might even just do one speed workout session in a week and just see how their body responds to it and just kind of gauge like what is that timeline looking like before they kind of feel like they're back to normal. Maybe that's 48 hours, maybe it's 72 hours. Whatever it happens to be, we're just going to like wait for that to present itself before we start adding another stimulus. And then from there, we can kind of follow that process before we get to a point where over time you can actually increase the training adaptation by reducing the recovery between those type of sessions, but you want to make sure that you're getting to that point. That's kind of like a higher level training input um, on top of just like the actual volume done at the goal training intensity. So first kind of being conservative with it and just kind of mapping out kind of how fast they're recovering from certain sessions. If it's like taking a lot longer than we expect, then I just usually assume like the volume of the training session was maybe a little too high, and then we back off on that. If the timeline is pretty average, then we just kind of follow that for a while until we see some normalization or some improvement in how quickly they bounce back before kind of recalibrating the frequency.
Do you have favorite tracking devices? You know, we've all the things, the Aura, the Whoop, the Garmin, you know, good old fashioned, you know, taking the actual heart rate first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
Do you find that there are some that are more reliable than others, or are you just working with whatever you've got?
Yeah, I mean, most people now are wearing some sort of device that's tracking this stuff. So usually what I'll do is I work on a platform called Training Peaks, which works great because it basically just will pull that data right off of whatever watch you're wearing, whether it's Garmin, Coro, Suuntos, or Apple Watch, any of these ones that track this stuff. And then it just kind of feeds it into that platform. So then I can see like, oh, what was your resting heart rate that morning? Or if I dig into the workout, what was your heart rate doing during these different intensities? I can compare them to other ones, or something even as complex as like, all right, you did a short interval session 4 weeks ago. You just did another one. You did the same training session today. Let's look and see what your heart rate was doing between those sessions, between those intervals, and see if you're improving in your body's ability to respond and bring your heart rate back down after you've done something that's higher intensity. And in terms of accuracy, usually the chest strap monitors or the armbands tend to be a little more accurate. The wrist-based ones can be a little more messy. None of them are perfect, so you do want to kind of keep an eye on if you see something that looks crazy, like, okay, let's not put too much emphasis on that one scenario and see if it kind of if it continues or if it's just like a bad reading or something like that. But um, I like to pair heart rate with just like communication because communication, I think, is something that can be a big value add because once someone kind of learns the different intensities in training, they get pretty good at knowing like, okay, that run felt easy, or that run felt like it was more kind of in the moderate intensity, or that run felt hard. And that sort of feedback is important to me because whether the heart rate is telling us something or not is sort of besides the point if your body is literally like screaming something different because it's going to be the thing that needs to be heading in the right direction at the end of the day. So as subjective as perceived effort sounds, it's actually one of the more objective ways to measure things because once you kind of get to the point where you can like really feel and understand like the different the different like sensations that are present across like an intensity spectrum, and then we can kind of look at it like, okay, that short interval session felt similar to the other ones. What's the pace look like during it? Are we seeing an improvement in pace here, or is it stagnating, or is it getting slower? And that can kind of drive whether our inputs are good or not.
The Clinician's Corner podcast is sponsored by Restorative Wellness Solutions, the premier clinical training program for health practitioners who want to learn how to finally get to the root source of their clients' health concerns and help them reverse complex health challenges and chronic illness. You can't afford to keep guessing. Your clients can't afford it either. Today's clients are sicker than ever before. Their health histories are more complex than ever before. And you simply can't deliver the results they crave or build the practice you desire without the right clinical skills. Enter Restorative Wellness Solutions' foundational course, Mastering the Art and Science of Gastrointestinal Healing. Our clinically proven, systematic approach to restoring balance within the body that has helped over 1,000 practitioners transform their clients' lives, grow their business, and change the way health is delivered. In less than 12 weeks, you'll develop the clinical skills and confidence you need to help your clients feel better faster. Learn how to work with advanced lab testing to identify food sensitivities and imbalances within the gut. Craft custom targeted protocols that truly resolve your client's gut issues and work safely and effectively with supplements to deliver consistently life-changing results. Enrollment for our fall 2024 semester is now open. Visit masterguthealing.com to apply today. Do you ever add in what I would call recovery amplifiers? Like, we think of recovery and it's the downtime. It's the time where, the workout sort of integrates into the body. Of course, sleep is going to be really important with that. Are there other things besides sleep and nutrition that can speed up or enhance the recovery process?
Yeah, I mean, sleep and nutrition are the big ones. Those are the ones I usually say, let's get these ones figured out and dialed in as much as possible. And then anything on top of that is probably going to be like a smaller improvement on top of that. Um, yeah, some of the other levers, I mean, like there's different things. Like I think like just general mobility and things like that can be useful practices. Some people will do like all sorts of different stuff, like red light therapy and things like that. Um, like ice baths and stuff like that, saunas and things that are some of those things I think are more adaptation based stuff versus recovery stuff. But if over time they improve your tolerance, then you could kind of inadvertently improve your recovery as a side note. Some of them are situational too, like ice baths, for example. There's maybe better evidence that hopping in an ice bath like right after a real high intensity strength session is maybe not in your best interest from a recovery standpoint because you actually want that kind of like acute inflammatory process to take in
Right.
and hit. But I would say like a lot of the kind of like more kind of like add-ons, their benefit is probably going to be in like improving some of the bigger movers. So if you take like red light, for example, that is going to my guess anyway, and I'm not an expert on this by any stretch of the imagination, but my guess would be like if someone's doing like red light therapy and that's helping with their circadian rhythm and therefore they're sleeping better, the big
Mhm.
improvement is probably the better sleep. But if the red light got them there, then great. I think there's a lot of kind of like interesting kind of like back to the basic hacks that are actually quite useful in kind of resetting circadian rhythm and keeping you in a situation where you're improving their quality of sleep. So that's where I think those oftentimes fit is that like how does this interplay with my ability to get restorative sleep or not to feel like I'm kind of on like cortisol overdrive all day long versus kind of like leveraging cortisol during a workout when you want it, but then kind of having that kind of come back down afterwards so you can kind of start that restorative side of the adaptation process.
Absolutely. Are you ever looking at things, you mentioned that like acute inflammatory response, and we know that the inflammatory burden overall, as well as, oxidative stress levels, when we're training at such higher volumes, they can be significant. Are you ever looking at how to support the body to then have those responses, but then, rein them in?
Yeah, I would say like with acute stressors, like acute inflammation and things like that, where it's actually like the body's response to the workload and it's making it better. That kind of falls into the category of just proper recovery. So if we're overloading too much on that, we're sort of treading on the recovery side of things. So like if someone was like just aggregating enough acute like acute inflammation and things like that from a training stimulus to the degree where now they're not recovering, we need to back off on that. So that's usually a reduction in the training load to make sure that we're just introducing enough of that so that they're actually responding to it and getting better versus getting too carried away to where now it's like, yeah, it's an acute stimulus, but you're doing it so frequently that you're not recovering from it, and now it's basically chronic.
Right.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Well, I know for myself, dealing, keeping an autoimmune at bay through doing this, always checking in on blood markers. Do you work with, I know that I've sort of took care of that for myself when we were working together. Are you ever looking at blood work with clients,
Yep.
or are you leaving that to them and their medical professionals?
Yeah, I mean a combination of both. Just depends on kind of what they're looking at. Like I'll if they're getting blood work and stuff like that and they want to share it with me, I'm definitely more than willing to take a look and see if I have any suggestions. If they have a professional working with them for it, then that's probably bonus, or a better option than me in most cases. But I think it is one of those things where it's like we're kind of guessing if we don't have that sort of add in.
Yeah.
So in terms of things to maybe add to the protocol that are maybe worth more than others, I would think some assessments with like blood panels and things like that are probably very much worthwhile. It's not something you probably have to get every month unless you're dealing with something that's pretty problematic and you're really trying to figure out whether you're doing the right thing or not. But yeah, if you're getting those like maybe quarterly or biannually or something like that, just so we can see if anything's trending in the right or wrong direction based on what we've seen in the past, I think just having that, starting that process a little earlier is going to just give you more information to base your historic trends off. So if something does feel off, and then the blood panel suggests, well, you know what, looks like you're low in this particular nutrient that would also carry the symptoms that are reflective of what you're dealing with, then it's just maybe a little quicker fix. We're not necessarily guessing at things. And sometimes these things can be goofy. So like I had a coaching client who he finished a race, and he was just recovering slower than normal and he felt a little more lethargic, kind of the symptoms of like low iron or anemia. So he went and got a blood panel, uh, just to kind of figure out what was going on. Turns out he had actually high iron, which actually mimics the same symptoms as low iron.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you kind of have like this perfect middle, but then going either direction from that kind of presents the same scenario in terms of how you feel. So it's like one of those things where it's like, you a lot of times runners will take iron supplements because they're low in iron or something and they need that. But for him, if he had done that, he would just exacerbated the problem. So he's now in a situation where he's trying to kind of manage like not only just his iron intake, but also like when he's eating iron and vitamin C rich foods, because that's going to increase the absorption rate of iron. But it's just an example of just like, you're probably better off kind of getting a good look at that and confirming, versus trying to guess at it and start throwing things at it and hoping for the best.
I love that you share that example because we are such big believers in testing and not guessing. And that's an excellent example of how symptoms of the deficiency can also mimic. It can happen in the presence of excess. It can happen with hormones. It can happen with all sorts of things. And yeah, I do think, as I said, as someone with autoimmune that I'm keeping my eyes on, what I like to do is I will always do blood work about a month after a race or a big effort, just to check in and see how things are doing. So I'm at the end of one training cycle, starting to think about what I'm doing for the next training cycle and can adjust as we go. I think probably the one thing that I would think everybody could benefit from across the board is some leaky gut support, because we know that endurance training can really trigger some gut issues. And even if it's just something like a little bit of L-glutamine or just something that's low dose on a regular basis, I think all endurance athletes can benefit from that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. And I mean, when we get into the ultra running world too, it's like you have that sort of exasperation during races to a large degree to, one of the products I actually use now actually has L-glutamine in it. Whether that's actually doing anything, um, at the like in the moment is that I don't know enough about it to know for sure, but I would imagine like chronic, or if you have L-glutamine in your diet at higher amounts on general, it's probably going to be pretty supportive.
Yeah, absolutely. One question I want to make sure we ask, this is from a member of our community beforehand. I want to just ask specifically strategies for increasing VO2 max. So just straight up training question.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this one. So I think one thing I'd like to share with VO2 Max first is like a lot of people probably are getting like a number given to them by their wearable, and it's like, oh, my
Yeah.
VO2 Max is like 45 or whatever it happens to be. And if you're new to running, you might see that number move, which is exciting. It's like, oh, sweet, my VO2 max is increasing. But after a bit of time, like not that long, like you could be training for like maybe one race or two races or so, you're likely going to see that number barely ever move any higher. So you could be working super hard at training your VO2 max and just get super frustrated because that number just does not want to budge. That's not a problem. Your VO2 max is pretty much genetically determined with like an increase adjustment of like 15 to 20%. So once you get that extra 15 to 20%, which is just going to be done in your early stages of development, you're basically sitting on that number as your VO2 max. So that doesn't mean you can't improve it though. What you want to do is you just want to kind of pivot what you're trying to improve there from that number that is your VO2 max to what they call your velocity at VO2 max. Or in other words, how fast are you moving at your VO2 max? Because that's going to take into account your efficiency. And it's really what matters at the end of the day anyway, is like how much improvement are you making at your ability to do something at that intensity. Um, so like the higher the VO2 max is technically better, but it's not necessarily the end all be all. Where if you look at just Olympic athletes, you'll see people finishing the exact same time with VO2 maxes that are 20 points apart from one another. The person with the lower VO2 max in that situation is just much more efficient for one reason or the other, and therefore they're able to go faster at a lower VO2 max than the person with the higher VO2 max is able to. But in terms of improving it, I like short intervals for this. So like your VO2 max is an intensity that you could likely sustain in like a hard effort for like 12, maybe 15 minutes. So you can go out and do a race or do a time trial where you give it a good hard push for 12, 15 minutes. That's going to be the intensity at which you're like working your VO2 max if it's evenly paced. So I like to do that just to kind of give yourself some guidance as to like how to structure some workouts. So let's say this person goes out and they do a 12-minute time trial. They go to the track, they run 12 minutes, about as hard as they could, and it comes out that for that 12 minutes they average 8-minute mile pace. So in the moment, their velocity at VO2 max is 8-minute mile pace. So if they want to improve that, they just want to start stressing that system. And the way to do that is by doing short intervals at a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio for durations. I think good starting durations are 2 to 4 minutes, but you can deviate from that. I wouldn't deviate longer than that, but you can go shorter than that if you want. But 2 to 4 minutes tends to be pretty supported by the research in terms of being able to maximize volume spent at the highest quality. So what that means is let's just take it right in the middle. Let's say 3 minutes. You're going to do 3-minute interval sessions. You'd want to go 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, and repeat that process for however many intervals you're going to do. And you're going to want to do them at that pace that you got from that VO2 max test. What you'll notice is after you've done that for probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4 to 6 weeks, that 8-minute mile pace is going to start to feel easier. That's your sign to make a calibration adjustment because you want to maintain intensity. You want to kind of go back to the intensity that you experienced during those early sessions when you were doing 8-minute mile pace. Now you're going to be doing the same workout, but at a faster pace. So let's say, for example, that person now, that same effort that they did on that first 3-minute interval session is now producing a 7:45 minute per mile pace. That's awesome. That's what we're looking for. That's what you're using to kind of guide whether the inputs are working or not, is are you getting faster at the intensity that we're targeting? In terms of the amount of volume to target for those, I usually like 12 to 15 minutes of total work to start. And then as you get more adjusted to it and the adaptation started occurring, you can add more volume to it, or you can increase the frequency in which you do it. So like week one, maybe you go out and do 5 by 3 minutes, and then you do that for a couple of weeks and you notice, okay, I'm bouncing back from this pretty quick. I'm going to either add more intervals to that session, or I'm going to add a second session during the week later on. Either of those are going to be a progression where you're increasing the workload that you're doing at that intensity. And all of that should be feeding into that understanding that as that intensity starts to drop for you at that pace that you determined with the time trial, make the adjustment to bring the pace down. So then over time you're making improvements. So that would be like directly working on your VO2 max. The other thing to think about too, in general, is if you're running at a lower intensity or even a higher intensity than whatever you're targeting, you're gonna still make adaptations. So if someone just, let's say someone was running 10 miles per week and they want to improve their VO2 max, they'll improve their VO2 max by working up to 20 miles per week, even though they're not doing any VO2 max work, because volume that's indirect to VO2 max will improve it if you increase the training load. So increasing volume will do that. You'll eventually get to a point where your body like gets adjusted to that and you won't see further improvements unless you make another add-on. So usually what ends up happening is people get to a point where they either don't want to, they feel like it's risky from an injury standpoint, they run out of time to add more volume, and then that's when I think adding in those short intervals can be a really fun lever and an easy lever to pull because you might even be able to reduce, well, you would almost certainly be able to reduce your weekly volume in the presence of a workout like that and still improve your VO2 max.
Such helpful information. Um, Last question on that. You mentioned that, the wearables like the Garmin, et cetera, you won't see much movement there. If you went into a facility that formally tests the VO2 max with like the big hookup
Yeah.
and you're on the treadmill and doing that, will you see improvements there, or is it just that improvements are not happening? I guess my question is
Mhm.
it the device, or is it that the VO2 max really does just stall out at a certain point?
Yeah, it's the VO2 max. So like if you
Okay.
took somebody who's untrained and they went in and got that VO2 max done, and let's
Yeah.
say they registered like 35, and then they went and they trained for like a year, they did like all the endurance training protocols that would be advised, and then go back and test again, they may see that go from 35 up to like say like, somewhere in the low to mid 40s. But
Mhm.
if they go back then on a 2 years or a year after that and test, they're likely going to be no higher than they were on that second test.
Okay.
So it is like you have a marginal, you have an improvement that can be made off of baseline of nothing, but then from there
Mhm.
that number is pretty fixed, and you're just looking at like improving your pace at that, which is I think a more fun target to go after.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Zach, this has been incredible. I could chat with you all night. I want to respect your time. You have an amazing offer for those who would like to do some coaching. You shared that team coaching. We have a code here for anyone who would like to join into Zach's team coaching program to get 20% off for the rest of the year. I'm going to pop this. I don't know if the live stream chat is working. If somebody can just respond to the link that I put in there to let me know if you see that. It's zachbitter.com/team dash coaching is the link. And the code is ZB or ZB, sorry, as the Canadian in me coming out, ZB Coach 20. So I'll put that here for anyone who is interested. We will, of course, post that in the show notes and in all the places. Thank you so much, Zach. Oh, I'm seeing folks. They see it. Great. Thank you all. Um, Thank you. This has been fantastic. I could just keep asking questions and keep you here all night. But this has been so insightful. For those of you who are here live and who missed the front end, I will see what we can do if we can get you guys a copy of the recording before it's officially out and released. It's a little different because it's on this platform, but I will see what we can do because I know there was lots of folks who were so interested and really wanting to come and hear you talk live. But thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties and for joining us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll just add one thing about the coaching discount thing, just so people don't
Yes.
confuse the code. That'll actually work right away for any of my pre-made plans for 20% off. So you could go and get that right away if you wanted to. For the team coaching one, that'll just take you to the onboarding like questionnaire. In which case, if you come through, just put on the comments in that you came through Margaret's group, and then those first 2 months of that will be 50% off.
Excellent. Here, I'll do the training plans. There's the training plans link. So I forgot there was two links. So we'll make sure you guys all get access to
Did it with
that.
the other one too. It's on the same website, but just so no
Okay.
one goes away confused.
And in case you can't tell, Zach is incredible, and he has been just such a delight to work with these last couple of years. And one of the cool things you can do as well is you can book time with him one-on-one to ask questions. So that's definitely something that I've done throughout all of my builds, is I save up my questions and then we book time and get to do this and ask all my little nitpicky questions. It's so fantastic. So thank you, Zach. Thank you for all you're doing and for just showing that there is is a different way to train, that it doesn't have to be, eat 100 pounds of pasta the night before
Definitely don't
and
need 100 pounds
all
of
the
pasta.
downstream effects. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Thank you all. Have a great night, and we will see you in a couple weeks. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Clinician's Corner. Don't forget to head to the show notes to access additional links and resources. And if you liked today's episode, please be sure to hit the follow button and consider leaving a review, sharing it on social, or texting it to a colleague. The more we spread the word, the more lives we can impact for the better.